The day my son declared my kitchen occupied territory, I had lasagna in the oven, 17 years of federal cartography files in the basement, and absolutely zero patience left for his ideology. He didn't know about the files. He didn't know a lot of things about me. That was his first mistake. His second mistake was using the word sovereignty in my presence, because I happen to know exactly what that word means under international law. And I was about to give him a masterclass he'd never forget. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me back up to the Tuesday in March when everything changed. The Tuesday when my son Tyler stood in my kitchen in his tech bro hoodie and explained to me, with the patient condescension of someone who has watched too many YouTube lectures, that the nation-state was dead. I grew up Eleanor Marsh, daughter of a surveyor from Tucson, who taught me to read topographic maps before I could ride a bike. I could triangulate a position with a compass and a paper chart by the time most kids my age were learning long division. When I was 22, I got hired by the U.S. Geological Survey, and over the following 31 years, I worked my way up to senior cartographic analyst, which is a fancy way of saying I drew the lines that told governments where their authority ended and someone else's began. I mapped disputed territories in the Balkans. I contributed to border demarcation projects in Central Asia. I sat in rooms in Geneva and The Hague while people in expensive suits argued about 7-meter strips of mountain ridge because those 7 meters mattered. Because lines on paper are the difference between law and chaos. I retired 4 years ago when my knees started objecting to the fieldwork and my ex-husband David had finally, mercifully, taken his golf clubs and his second opinion on everything and moved to Phoenix with his dental hygienist. I came back to the house in Maplewood, New Jersey, the house where Tyler grew up, the house with the big backyard and the vegetable garden I'd been neglecting for a decade, and I decided to grow tomatoes and read novels and exist at a pace that suited me. Tyler was 29 when he moved back in. He'd been living in San Francisco doing something with blockchain infrastructure for a startup that had just gone through its third round of layoffs. He needed, he said, a transitional period to recalibrate his operational focus, which meant he needed his old room back and didn't want to pay rent on a 1-bedroom in Hoboken while he figured out what came next. I said yes, because he's my son and I love him. And also because the house felt too quiet sometimes, in a way I didn't like admitting. He arrived on a Sunday in November with 3 oversized duffel bags, a standing desk, 2 monitors, and a friend named Cass who was just crashing for a few weeks and then materialized into a semi-permanent fixture in my guest room. Cass was 27, laconic, and wore the same North Face vest every day as if it were a uniform. He worked in Web3 consulting, which as far as I could tell meant he spent 12 hours a day on his laptop producing nothing visible. The first few weeks were fine. I cooked. They appeared at mealtimes like large, expensive cats. Tyler occasionally did the dishes. Cass nodded at me in the hallway with the expression of someone who has been told to be polite to a quaint historical exhibit. Life resumed a shape, even if it wasn't the shape I'd imagined. Then Tyler discovered podcasts, or rather, a specific cluster of podcasts dedicated to what he called sovereign individual philosophy, and everything went sideways from there. It started small. He'd mention, over dinner, that taxation was essentially coercive extraction. I'd nod and pass the salad. He'd note that nation-states were 19th century technology, and I'd ask if he wanted more bread. I recognized what he was doing. I'd watched enough young men discover a coherent-sounding ideology and suddenly see the entire world through its lens. I'd been 25 once. I knew the particular intoxication of feeling like you'd found the map that explained everything. What I didn't expect was the evening he decided to explain it to me directly, in my own kitchen, with the specific tone of someone correcting a charming misconception in a child. He came in while I was sliding the lasagna out of the oven, Cass trailing behind him with a green smoothie. The kitchen smelled of basil and cheese. Outside, the backyard was bare and brown in the late autumn light, my neglected garden beds running along the back fence, the old oak tree in the corner dropping the last of its leaves. "Mom," Tyler said, sitting down at the kitchen table with the settled authority of someone calling a meeting to order. "Cass and I have been thinking about the living situation here, and we want to have a real conversation about how this household operates." I set the lasagna on the trivet and turned around. He had his hands folded on the table. Cass stood to one side with his smoothie, watchful, neutral, the way a press secretary stands during a difficult briefing. "What about it?" I said. "Well," Tyler paused, choosing his words with the care of a man who has rehearsed. "You have to understand that the way most households are run is based on really outdated models of authority. Hierarchical, top-down, based on legal ownership structures that themselves reflect a decaying institutional framework." "I own the house," I said. "Technically, yes, in a legacy legal sense. But Cass and I have been talking about creating an autonomous living structure here, a kind of decentralized community space where contributions and needs are balanced without arbitrary authority claims." I pulled off my oven mitts. The lasagna steamed between us. Outside, a crow landed on my fence post and stared at us with what I felt was appropriate editorial judgment. "Tyler," I said slowly, "are you telling me my rules don't apply in my own house?" "I'm saying," he continued, with the patience of a man who has practiced this speech, "that we're living in a post-institutional era. The nation-state is a dying construct. Physical ownership is being replaced by contribution-based governance. What we're building here is essentially an autonomous cell, a sovereign unit operating outside the legacy power structures. Your rules are a relic of a system that no longer has legitimacy." "Mom, you live in a system that's dead," Cass added quietly, as if offering a kind diagnosis. "Decentralization," Tyler said, warming to his theme. "Self-determination, sovereignty. These are the principles of the future. Your framework of my house, my rules, it's just a smaller version of the same coercive state apparatus that's already collapsing." The lasagna sat between us, emitting small wisps of steam. I looked at my son who I had pushed out of my own body, who I had driven to soccer practice in this car, and this car, and this car, who I had paid for 2 years of a philosophy minor he'd eventually abandoned for computer science, who I had fed approximately 11,000 meals in this kitchen. And I felt something click very quietly into place inside me. Not anger, something colder and more precise than anger. The professional part of my brain, the part that had spent 3 decades drawing lines and knowing exactly what those lines meant, woke up and started paying very close attention. "Decentralization," I repeated. "Exactly. Sovereignty, self-determination of peoples, operating outside legacy institutional frameworks." "Yes," he looked relieved. "Exactly, Mom. You get it." "I do," I said. "I really, really do." I sliced the lasagna and served it with the perfectly pleasant expression of a woman with a plan. "Let's eat." That night, after Tyler and Cass had retreated to their respective screens, I went down to my basement and found the box I was looking for. It was labeled International Law Reference, Personal, in black marker on the side. Inside was a copy of the Montevideo Convention on the Rights and Duties of States, a battered paperback of Crawford's The Creation of States in International Law, 3 decades of professional journals, and several laminated reference sheets I'd kept from my time working on demarcation cases. I carried the box upstairs, made myself a cup of tea, and read until 2 in the morning. By the time I went to bed, I had the outline of a plan. It was, even by my own exacting standards, a very good plan. I had spent 31 years drawing the lines that divided the world. Now I was going to draw one more. The following morning, before either Tyler or Cass had emerged from their rooms, I went out to the backyard in my coat and boots and walked the perimeter of the property, slowly and deliberately, the way I used to walk a survey site. The garden beds along the back fence, the old oak in the corner, the patio with its weathered table and chairs, the side gate that led to the driveway, the strip of lawn between my property and the Kowalskis next door, marked by a knee-high wooden fence David had put up in 2003. I noted the natural features. I noted the access points. I noted the relationship between the interior of the house and the exterior structures, the garage at the end of the driveway, the tool shed by the back fence, the Weber grill Tyler had brought with him from San Francisco and installed on the patio like a conquering flag. I went back inside and made a second cup of tea. Then I called my old colleague, Martha Jennings, who had retired 3 years before me and was now, I happen to know, doing private consulting work in municipal boundary documentation. "Eleanor," she said, picking up on the second ring, "it's been months. Are you all right?" "I'm wonderful," I said. "Martha, I need to ask you something. Hypothetically, if a property owner wanted to formally document the internal boundaries of their residential property, define specific zones with different use designations, what would be the proper procedure for registering that with the municipal planning office?" There was a pause. "Eleanor," Martha said carefully, "what are you doing?" "Decentralizing," I said. "Can you help me?" She helped me. Martha had always appreciated a creative application of regulatory frameworks, which was one of the reasons we'd worked well together for 20 years. Over the next 3 days, while Tyler held court in my kitchen about the tyranny of central banking, and Cass typed things on his laptop with the focused urgency of someone defusing a bomb, I did the following. I drafted a formal declaration, modeled closely on the Unilateral Declaration of Independence of Kosovo, 2008, which I had in my reference files. I drew up a detailed boundary map of the property using my survey-grade precision, designating the backyard, approximately 1,800 square feet, including the garden beds, the oak tree, the tool shed, and critically, the patio with the Weber grill, as the sovereign territory of the constitutional monarchy of Eleanoria. I filed the boundary documentation with the Maplewood Municipal Planning Office as a residential zone designation update, a category that, as Martha had confirmed, did not require a building permit and had to be accepted for filing within 48 hours. I ordered a crown from a theatrical supply company in New York. It arrived on Thursday. It was gold, set with red and purple glass stones, and it was magnificent. I also found in the garage a large roll of white surveyor's chalk line I'd kept from my last fieldwork kit. I called my neighbor, Ruth Kowalski, and explained the general situation. Ruth, who had watched Tyler park his Tesla in her spot twice without apologizing, expressed her full support and asked if she could attend the declaration ceremony. I set the date for Saturday at 11 a.m. I sent Tyler a formal written notice, printed on my old official USGS letterhead, informing him that a property boundary announcement would take place at that time and requesting his presence. I slid it under his door. I heard him read it. I heard him say, "What the?" and then muffled conversation with Cass. I went to bed smiling for the first time in 3 months. Saturday morning dawned cold and clear, the sky the particular pale blue of late November. I was up at 7. I made coffee. I put on my good wool coat, the navy one I'd bought for an international conference in Brussels in 2011, and I pinned my USGS Senior Analyst badge to the lapel for reasons that were mostly aesthetic and entirely intentional. I set the crown on the kitchen table where Tyler would see it when he came down. He came down at 9:30, hair still tangled from sleep, and stopped dead in the kitchen doorway. Cass was behind him. They both stared at the crown. "Mom," Tyler said, "what is that?" "That," I said, pouring my second cup of coffee, "is a crown." "I can see that. Why is it on the kitchen table?" "Because I haven't put it on yet," I said pleasantly. "Coffee?" By 11 o'clock, I had everything I needed. Ruth Kowalski was there, bundled in her winter coat, holding a thermos of tea and looking delighted. My friend Barbara from the gardening club had also come, because I'd called her on Thursday, and she had immediately said, "Oh, I absolutely have to see this." Tyler and Cass stood on the back porch, Tyler with his arms crossed, wearing the expression of a man who suspects he's walked into a situation he doesn't have the vocabulary to navigate. Cass, for the first time since I'd met him, had put down his laptop. I walked out onto the lawn with my chalk line dispenser. Starting at the corner of the patio, I laid down a crisp white line across the grass, cutting directly in front of the Weber grill, across the lawn to the fence, marking the territorial boundary of the Kingdom of Eleanoria. The chalk line was bright and precise against the dormant winter grass. I laid it exactly as I had laid 10,000 boundary lines in 31 years, with complete confidence in its legitimacy. Then I went back to the porch, picked up the crown from where I'd set it on the outdoor table, and placed it on my head. Ruth started clapping. Barbara took a photo. I unfolded the document I'd prepared, printed in formal typeface on heavy paper, and read aloud. "By the authority vested in me as the lawful owner of this territory, and in accordance with the principles set forth in the Montevideo Convention of 1933, specifically the criteria for statehood under international law, namely, a permanent population, a defined territory, an effective government, and the capacity to enter into relations with other states, I, Eleanor Margaret Marsh, do hereby declare the establishment of the constitutional monarchy of Eleanoria, comprising the entirety of the rear garden, patio, and associated structures of this property. Effective immediately, the territory of Eleanoria is a sovereign entity, subject to its own laws and governance, and not to the jurisdiction of any occupying power." I folded the document, looked up, and found Tyler staring at me with his mouth slightly open. "What," he said, "are you doing?" "Decentralizing," I said. "You were right, Tyler. The old institutional frameworks are dead. Sovereignty belongs to the individual. Self-determination is the future." I smiled at him with the full warmth of a woman who has just played the opening move of a chess game she intends to win. "I'm so glad you helped me see that." Ruth was still clapping. She had brought little flags. I had no idea where she'd found them. She must have made them the night before. Small paper flags on chopsticks that said Eleanoria in red marker. She handed one to Barbara. "This is insane," Tyler said. "Sovereign individuals don't use that kind of language about neighboring states," I said pleasantly. "It sets a bad diplomatic tone." The situation, Tyler explained to Cass that afternoon, in tones I was absolutely not listening to through the kitchen window while pruning my herb pots on the interior side of the boundary line, was a classic power play. It was a manipulation tactic. It was his mother refusing to engage with the actual intellectual content of the conversation and retreating into literal-minded performance. He used the word regressive at least 3 times. I potted a rosemary cutting and considered my next move. The Weber grill was behind the boundary line. So was the garden shed. So was the oak tree Tyler liked to sit under with his laptop on nice days when he worked outside for a change of scenery. The patio, with its weathered table and the good outdoor chairs, was Eleanoria. The narrow concrete path from the back door to the side gate ran directly along the chalk line, and depending on which side you were walking on, you were either in New Jersey or in an independent constitutional monarchy. I had measured this deliberately. The tool shed contained Tyler's road bike, which he hadn't ridden since August. It also contained my collection of garden tools, 3 bags of mulch, and a spare propane tank for the grill. The grill, as I have mentioned, was in Eleanoria. The propane was not. These details would matter. That evening, I sat at the kitchen table with a sheet of paper and a box of markers and designed the currency of Eleanoria. I had considered several options during my planning phase and settled on the most practical one. I had approximately 40 large metal jar lids in my recycling bin, saved from the summer's canning season. I painted them gold with craft paint. I'd bought it Thursday in the same trip where I'd purchased a small wooden stake and a square of fabric for the Eleanoria flag, which was cream-colored with a compass rose, which I felt was thematically appropriate given my cartographic background. On each coin I drew with a fine black marker the Eleanoria coat of arms, which I had designed with some care. A crown above a tomato plant, which was both the national emblem and an accurate representation of the kingdom's primary industry, and beneath it the national motto, which I had chosen with great deliberation. Accurate lines hold. I made 40 coins. I stacked them neatly. I wrote out in the same formal typeface I'd used for the declaration the Eleanoria currency and visa regulations. The document established the following. Entry into Eleanoria territory required a valid visitor's visa. Visitor's visas cost 5 mama coins per 24-hour period, or 20 mama coins for a diplomatic week pass. Work visas, required for any individual wishing to use Eleanoria infrastructure, including the grill, the garden shed, or the oak tree, cost 30 mama coins per month. Mama coins could be earned through the following approved activities. Weeding garden bed A, 5 coins per hour. Weeding garden bed B, 5 coins per hour. Planting seedlings under supervision, 8 coins per hour. Turning compost, 6 coins per hour. Raking leaves, 4 coins per hour. And other tasks as designated by the Crown at its discretion. I also added a section on customs and border protocols, which I was fairly proud of. All goods crossing the territorial boundary were subject to a 5% tariff, payable in mama coins, with certain exceptions for humanitarian aid. I would define what constituted humanitarian aid and diplomatic pouches. I reserve the right to inspect diplomatic pouches. I was putting the final touches on this document when Tyler appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Mom," he said, and his voice had shifted, softer now, the particular register of someone attempting to de-escalate. "Can we talk? Seriously?" "Of course," I said. "Would you like tea?" He sat down. I put the kettle on. "I want to apologize," he said, "if I came across as dismissive the other day. I wasn't trying to be condescending. I I've been thinking a lot about these ideas, and I wanted to share them with you. And I appreciated that, I said, which was technically true. But this, he gestured vaguely toward the backyard, visible through the kitchen window in the dark, my chalk line just visible in the porch light. This isn't productive. It's like you're mocking me. Tyler, I said carefully, setting 2 cups on the counter, I want you to understand something. I've spent 31 years working in boundary demarcation and territorial sovereignty. I've testified before international courts about the legitimacy of borders. I've spent time in countries where the question of where one state ends and another begins meant the difference between safety and violence. When you told me that borders are a relic of a dying system and that sovereign individuals have the right to self-determination, you were describing a set of principles I have been professionally engaged with for my entire adult life. I poured the hot water. So I'm not mocking you. I'm taking you completely seriously. Here's your tea. He wrapped his hands around the mug and looked at me. His face, in the kitchen light, looked younger than 29. He'd always had that quality, even as a boy, the ability to look, in unguarded moments, like someone who wasn't quite sure the rules applied to him in the specific way everyone else claimed they did. The boundary marking, he said finally, is a bit much. Is it? Your philosophy says sovereign individuals have the right to establish autonomous zones operating outside legacy institutional frameworks. I am a sovereign individual. I have established an autonomous zone. I sat down across from him. Or does the principle only apply when you're the one declaring sovereignty? He opened his mouth, closed it. There's also the question of the grill, I said, sliding the currency document across the table. He picked it up. He read it. I watched his face make a series of small journeys, confusion, disbelief, something that was almost amusement before it corrected itself into something more defensive. Mama coins, he read aloud. Legal tender within Eleanoria. The exchange rate is currently not negotiable. Mom, you can't seriously. This is about a grill. You're not actually going to... Tyler, I said, with the serene patience of a woman who has spent 3 decades in rooms where people argued about whether a GPS coordinate was in country A or country B. I absolutely am. You want to use the grill, you need a work visa. You need a work visa, you need mama coins. You need mama coins, you need to earn them. The garden beds need weeding before spring. The compost hasn't been turned in 6 weeks. I suggest you start planning your economic activity accordingly. He stared at me for a long moment. Then he put the document down, very deliberately, picked up his tea and said, I'm going to talk to Cass. Give him my regards, I said, and let him know that if he wants to continue using the patio as a secondary workspace, he'll need to file for a visitor's visa by end of business Monday. Tyler left. I heard him on the stairs, heard the low murmur of conversation through the ceiling. I cleared the cups, washed them, and went to bed. I slept very well. The next 3 days were, from an external perspective, quiet. Tyler left for client meetings. He was doing some freelance contract work. And Cass sat in the kitchen on his laptop and gave me the careful, watchful look of a man reassessing his situation. He was, I noticed, a more careful observer than Tyler. He didn't react quickly. He gathered information first. On Tuesday morning, he knocked on my study door. Mrs. Marsh, he said, can I ask you something? Eleanor, I said, and yes. He stood in the doorway, tall and thin in his North Face vest. The compost. Is it actually 5 coins an hour to turn it? I looked at him over my reading glasses. 6, I said. Right, 6, he paused. Is there a lot of it? About 3 months' worth. It needs to be turned twice, then moved to the bed along the east fence. He calculated something in his head. That's probably 3 hours of work, maybe 4, if you work efficiently. Another pause. And work visa is 30 coins a month? Correct. He nodded slowly. So if I turn the compost now, before it gets colder, I'd have enough for a work visa and some left over for day passes. Your math is correct, I said. Okay, he said. I'll do it this afternoon. I handed him a pair of garden gloves from the hook by the door. Welcome to the Eleanorian labor market, I said. He actually almost smiled. Tyler returned from his client meetings to find Cass in the backyard, turning compost in 30-degree weather, singing softly to himself. Tyler stood on the back porch and stared at his friend. What are you doing? He demanded. Earning coins, Cass said without stopping. Cass, buddy, you can't be serious. She has the grill, man, Cass shrugged. And the shed. My bike's in the shed. The shed is ours. We live here. Cass paused, straightened up, and looked at Tyler with the expression of a man who has been thinking carefully. Tyler, bro, walk me through something. You've been saying for months that sovereign individuals have the right to self-determination, that physical ownership within legacy legal structures is a social construct, that decentralized authority is more legitimate than centralized authority. He gestured toward the chalk line. She is doing exactly what you described. She owns the property. She's decentralizing it. She drew the line. What's your counter-argument? Tyler opened his mouth. Specifically, Cass added, what's your counter-argument that doesn't boil down to, but it's inconvenient for me? Tyler closed his mouth. Thought so, Cass said, and went back to the compost. It was at this point, I later learned, that Tyler called his father in Phoenix. David, to his very limited credit, apparently told Tyler that I was a deeply stubborn woman who knew international law better than most lawyers, and that if Tyler thought he was going to win a boundary dispute with me, he should reconsider his entire approach. This was, given that David had spent 22 years doing exactly that and had ultimately fled to Arizona, fairly authoritative advice. Tyler apparently found it unhelpful. He also, and this is the part I found most interesting when Cass eventually told me about it, called a friend of his from the blockchain world, a woman named Priya, who had a law degree before she pivoted to Web3, and explained the situation, expecting her to confirm that my declaration was legally meaningless. Priya had listened carefully, asked several clarifying questions, and then, according to Cass, laughed for about 90 seconds before composing herself enough to say, the Montevideo Convention thing is actually, it doesn't work for a backyard, but her framing of the property rights argument within the context of sovereign individual philosophy is genuinely coherent. And if she's filed it as a zoning designation update, she might have actually, at which point Tyler hung up. I was not aware of any of this at the time. I was in my study, finalizing the Eleanoria trade policy document, which I had decided to model loosely on the principles of mercantilism, specifically as applied to access to the propane tank. The crown was on my desk. I wore it when I worked. It turned out, somewhat to my own surprise, to feel correct. I had not expected to enjoy this as much as I was enjoying it. But there was something profoundly satisfying about applying my actual expertise, the expertise Tyler had implicitly dismissed when he told me my framework was obsolete, to a problem in my own backyard. I had spent 31 years using the principles of sovereignty and territorial demarcation to resolve other people's disputes. Now I was using them to conduct one of my own. The tools were exactly the same. The precision required was exactly the same. The only difference was the scale. The scale, I had learned early in my career, was never the point. A 7-meter strip of mountain ridge and a 1,800 square foot backyard were governed by the same logic. Lines held because the people drawing them understood what they meant. I understood what my line meant. Tyler, I suspected, was beginning to understand what it meant too. On Thursday, he knocked on my study door. He didn't wait for me to answer before opening it, which was a habit I'd been meaning to address for some time. "Mom," he said, "I need to use the grill Friday night. I told some people they could come over." "What people?" "Friends from the city. Dev and Priya and Marcus and a couple others." He paused. "There might be 8 of us." 8 people. I set down my pen. "For a cookout?" "Yeah. In Eleanoria." "On the patio," he said, with the forced patience of a man trying not to engage with the premise. "In the backyard of your house." "The patio of Eleanoria," I corrected gently, "which is a distinct sovereign jurisdiction." I opened my desk drawer and produced the visitor and event visa application form, which I had prepared on Wednesday with the comfortable efficiency of someone who had filled out a great many official forms in her life. It was 1 page, clean and clear: name of applicant, duration of visit, purpose of visit, party size, and a section at the bottom titled "Goods to be imported into Eleanoria, subject to 5% customs tariff." I slid it across the desk. "You'll need to file a group event visa application. For 8 non-residents, that's 40 mama coins for the evening, plus customs on whatever food and beverages you're bringing across the border." He looked at the form. He looked at me. He looked at the crown on my head. "I don't have 40 coins," he said. "The garden beds," I said, "are waiting." There was a silence. The heating vent ticked. Outside the window, the bare November trees stood against a gray sky. "This is," Tyler said slowly, with visible effort to keep his voice level, "genuinely the most absurd situation I have ever been in." "Tyler," I said, "you told me my rules don't apply in my own house. You told me I was living in a dead system. You told me that physical property ownership was a social construct and that decentralized authority was more legitimate than institutional power. I have been paying very close attention to your philosophy." I folded my hands on the desk. "Now you're telling me you want to use my sovereign territory to host a cookout without a visa. Do you hear how that sounds?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Fine," he said finally through his teeth. "What do I have to do to earn 40 coins before Friday?" "I'll have a work plan ready tomorrow morning," I said. "The beds along the south fence haven't been put to bed for winter yet. There's also a large section of ivy that needs cutting back before it takes over the oak roots. And the compost needs to be turned again. Cass was thorough, but there are sections he missed." "Cass," Tyler repeated. "He's already got 18 coins," I said. "He's very motivated." Tyler left without another word. I heard him go down the stairs, heard the muffled sound of his voice, and then Cass's, and then what I was fairly certain was laughter, quickly suppressed, but definitely laughter, from Cass. I picked up my pen and went back to the trade policy document. The Friday cookout was, by any measure, a complete success, though perhaps not in the way Tyler had intended. He'd done the work, I'll give him that. He was out in the yard Thursday morning at 9, which is the earliest I'd seen him outdoors since his arrival, and he worked through the afternoon with the focused grimness of a man who has made a calculation and determined that this is the least bad option available to him. The south fence beds were cleared and mulched by noon. The ivy cutting took another 2 hours. He turned the missed sections of compost without being asked. By 4 in the afternoon, he had 38 coins, which I rounded up to 40 on the grounds that the ivy work had been genuinely difficult, and I appreciated the initiative. I issued the group event visa on official Eleanoria letterhead, which I had also designed this week, and posted it on the refrigerator door. His friends arrived Friday at 7. Dev and Marcus came together, tall and comfortable in their weekend clothes, the easy body language of people who spend their days in open-plan offices and their evenings at rooftop bars. Priya came with a woman she introduced as Asha, who was, I gathered, some kind of compliance attorney. 2 others followed, another software person named Joe and a quiet young woman named Lena, who turned out to be a graphic designer. They arrived through the front door. Tyler ushered them through the house, and when they reached the back door and could see the backyard, the chalk lines still crisp in the winter grass, the small Eleanoria flag I'd installed on a garden stake by the boundary, the crown sitting on the outdoor table where I'd left it as an ambassador's gesture of hospitality, there was a pause that Tyler clearly had not planned for. "Tyler," Priya said very slowly, "is that a flag?" "Don't," Tyler said. "Does your mom, is she actually—" "Please don't." "Tyler." Priya turned to look at him with the expression of someone who has had a theory confirmed in the most satisfying possible way. "You told me about this, on the phone. I thought you were exaggerating." "I wasn't," he said flatly. I appeared in the kitchen doorway, wearing the crown, carrying a tray of lemonade. "Welcome to Eleanoria," I said. "I'm Eleanor, Queen by popular declaration." I smiled at the group. "Your group event visa is valid until midnight. Customs on your cooler, I can see you've brought chips and burger buns, will be nominal. We're running a favorable trade relationship with the United States this quarter." There was a moment of absolute silence. Then Priya started laughing. It was a real laugh, deep and genuine, the kind that doubles a person over. Dev joined her almost immediately. Marcus covered his mouth with his hand, his shoulders shaking. Asha looked at Tyler with the expression of a woman filing something away for later use. "Your mom," Dev managed, "is incredible." "Please," Tyler said, to no one in particular. "Tyler," Priya straightened up, still smiling. "She used the Montevideo Convention on her own backyard. I looked it up after you called me. The Montevideo Convention. Do you know how many international lawyers know the Montevideo Convention off the top of their head?" "She was a cartographer," Tyler said, "for the government." "I know," Priya said. "You told me that too, in the context of explaining why her opinions on decentralization were outdated." Tyler said nothing. "How's that working out for you?" she asked pleasantly. I set the lemonade tray on the outdoor table and began the formal customs inspection of the cooler, which I conducted with full professional seriousness, itemizing the burgers, the buns, the beer, and 2 bags of chips, and calculating the 5% tariff with a small calculator I'd brought outside for exactly this purpose. I assessed the total at 2.5 mama coins, which I rounded to 3 and accepted from Tyler's dwindling supply with gracious sovereignty. Cass, who had accrued 24 coins by this point and therefore had a valid work visa, operated the grill. He did this with the quiet competence of a man who has found, to his own surprise, that he enjoys having a task with clear parameters and visible results. He flipped burgers. He arranged the patties with methodical attention to doneness. He and Asha had a long conversation about something that seemed to involve regulatory frameworks, which I found deeply encouraging. By 9 o'clock, something interesting had happened. Tyler's friends were having a better time than he was. Dev had asked to see the official Eleanoria currency documents and was reading through them with genuine appreciation at the kitchen table. Lena had borrowed the crown, I'd offered it, diplomatic gesture, and was wearing it while she talked to Priya by the fire pit. Priya, it turned out, had done her bar exam in international law before moving into tech, and she and I had a 40-minute conversation about the practical application of self-determination principles that Tyler drifted over to once and then drifted away from when it became clear that I was the one holding the stronger analytical position. Marcus, at some point, asked me how I'd come up with the mama coin system. It's based on the core economic logic of earned currency, I said. Value is created through labor. Labor is directed toward productive outcomes. Incentives align behavior. It's not complicated. It's basic economics. Tyler keeps talking about tokenomics, Marcus said thoughtfully. Yes, I said, same principle. Marcus looked at Tyler, who was standing by the edge of the boundary line with his hands in his hoodie pocket, looking out at the yard with the expression of a man thinking very hard about something. Then Marcus looked back at me. He didn't realize you'd actually know what you were talking about. No, I said, he didn't. That was his mistake. That, I agreed, was his mistake. At 11:15, as the party wound down and people began gathering coats, Priya found me in the kitchen. Mrs. Marsh, she said. Eleanor. She had her coat half on, her lawyer's composure back in place, but warm. I want you to know that this is the most elegant application of sovereign individual philosophy I've seen in practice. He set the premises, and you followed them to their logical conclusion. That's what the philosophy says to do, I said. It is, she agreed. He just didn't expect you to actually do it. She paused. The coin system is particularly good. Earned currency, labor as value creation. It's basically the whole Web3 argument, but applied to compost. I thought so, I said. She laughed again, softer this time. You're not going to stop, are you? Not until he figures out what he was actually saying to me, I said, and what it means when other people take you at your word. She nodded slowly. Fair enough. She buttoned her coat. For what it's worth, and I know Tyler, and I'm telling you this because I think it might actually help, he's not a bad person. He's just been in a room with the same 10 people for too long, all telling each other the same things, and he forgot that the world has people in it who know things he doesn't. I know, I said. He's my son. Yeah, she said. I can tell. She left. The last guest closed the front door. I washed the lemonade glasses and stacked them in the drying rack and listened to the quiet house settle around me. Tyler came in from the backyard last, carrying the Eleanoria flag, which had blown over in the evening wind. He set it carefully on the kitchen counter, which surprised me enough that I paused at the sink. Thanks, he said, for tonight. You did the work, I said. You earned the visa. He stood for a moment, not quite looking at me, then said, Priya says you know more about international law than most lawyers. Priya is correct, I said. She also said, he stopped, started again. She said the whole thing is a pretty coherent argument. It is. Another pause. Mom, he said very quietly, are you trying to tell me something? I turned off the faucet and dried my hands on the kitchen towel and looked at my son. Tyler, I said, I'm telling you exactly the thing you told me. I'm just using the same language. I thought it might be clearer that way. He was quiet for a long moment. I should probably, he started. Sleep, I said. Tomorrow there's more ivy. He went upstairs. I stood in the kitchen for a while, listening to the house, and then I went to my study and sat at my desk and looked at the crown. I had not expected this to be the beginning of Phase 2, but it was. The ivy turned out to be the least of it. I had been vague in my planning about Phase 2. I'd known I needed a second act, but I hadn't been certain what form it would take until Tyler handed me the shape of it himself, 3 days after the cookout, on a Tuesday morning when I came into the kitchen to find him on the phone with someone he clearly hadn't expected me to overhear. I came downstairs early. The kitchen light was on, the coffee maker running. Tyler was standing at the window with his back to the door, speaking in the careful, controlled voice of someone choosing words precisely. Not about the property value, it's about the asset structure. If the house is registered under an LLC, then, yeah, I know, but no, she doesn't know about it. I was going to bring it up when... Okay, but the thing is, if she transfers it to... He heard my footstep on the kitchen tile and turned. His face did something very interesting in that half second before he recalibrated. It went through surprise, then calculation, then a performance of casual normalcy that wasn't quite fast enough to cover the calculation. "Mom, hey," he said, with the specific brightness of someone changing gears. "I'll call you back," he added into the phone, and hung up. I went to the coffee maker. I poured a cup. The kitchen was very quiet except for the sound of the refrigerator and a car passing outside, and the internal sound of something I had not quite let myself think about until this moment, clicking into full, cold clarity. "LLC," I said. "What?" "You said LLC. You said if the house is registered under an LLC." I held my coffee cup in both hands and looked at my son across the kitchen. "Whose LLC?" He set his phone on the counter. "Mom. Tyler." My voice was perfectly even. I had a 31-year professional record of keeping my voice even in rooms where the stakes were high, and I drew on every year of it now. "Whose LLC?" He rubbed the back of his neck, a gesture I recognized from his childhood as the prelude to a complicated truth. "Mine and Cass's. We were talking about setting up a property holding entity as part of the decentralized asset structure where..." "Stop." I set down the coffee cup. "You were going to suggest that I transfer my house to an LLC held by you and Cass." It's more nuanced than that. Tyler. I looked at him very carefully. "This house is mine. I bought it in 1998. I made every mortgage payment by myself. When your father and I divorced, he got the Phoenix property and I kept this one. It is the single largest asset I own. You were planning to suggest that I transfer it into an entity controlled by you." "Controlled jointly," he said. "It would be a governance structure where you and Cass have voting rights." A pause. "Among others." "Who are the others?" He didn't answer. "Tyler," I said, "how long have you been planning this?" The silence that followed lasted long enough to tell me everything I needed to know. Long enough to retroactively recolor every conversation we'd had about decentralization and sovereign individuals and the death of legacy institutional frameworks. Long enough to turn his theories from intellectual fashion into something with a specific material goal at the end of it. "The philosophy," I said softly, "was a pitch." "It wasn't. Mom, I genuinely believe in those ideas." "I don't doubt that you do. I also noticed that applying those ideas to my property would result in you having access to an asset worth approximately $700,000 in the current market." I picked up my coffee cup. My hands were steady. The cold in my chest was not anger, not yet. It was something more like the particular clarity I'd felt standing in a field in Kosovo in 2000, watching a boundary dispute resolve itself into something undeniable. The moment when the map and the territory finally matched. "Get Cass." "Mom, get him down here, please. I'd like to speak to both of you." Tyler went upstairs. I stood at the kitchen window and looked at the backyard in the early morning light. The chalk line was still there, faded a little from rain, but still legible. The Eleanoria flag stood at the garden stake, slightly askew in the winter wind. The Weber grill sat on the patio, iron and patient. I had been trained to see the relationship between a line on paper and the territory it described. I had been trained to understand that the legitimacy of a boundary depended not on the line itself, but on the authority of the person drawing it. I had been drawing lines in this backyard for the past 3 weeks as a lesson in applied philosophy. I had not fully realized until this moment that I was also drawing the line that mattered most. Cass came down first, in jeans and the North Face vest, with the wary look of a man who does not know exactly what he's walked into, but suspects it's serious. Tyler came behind him. They both stood in the kitchen doorway. "Sit down," I said. They sat. "I want to understand," I said, setting my coffee cup down, "exactly what you two have been planning. Not the version where it's a philosophical exercise in decentralized governance. The actual version." There was a silence. I waited it out with the patience of a professional who has sat in rooms where the person with the most information won by simply saying less. Cass spoke first. "The LLC idea," he said, "was mostly mine, initially. Tyler brought it up as a possibility a while back, and I thought the structure made sense." He was looking at the table. "The idea was that if the property was held in an entity structure, it could generate income, short-term rental, shared workspace, that kind of thing, and we'd all benefit, including you." "Including me," I repeated. "You'd retain residential rights," Tyler said, "and a minority interest in the—" "A minority interest," I said, "in my own home." He stopped. "Let me explain something," I said, "and I want you to listen to me very carefully, because I am not going to repeat it." I folded my hands on the table. The morning light came through the kitchen window and lit the dust in the air above the counter, small particles moving in slow currents. I have spent my career in rooms where people tried to use procedural complexity to obscure the basic question of who controls what. I have been in negotiations where parties spent 6 months arguing about governance structures and voting rights because they did not want to say plainly that they wanted to take something that wasn't theirs. My voice was still even. I was proud of it. I recognized the playbook, and I want you to know that I recognized it before this morning. I just didn't have confirmation until now. Tyler was very still. "Here is what is going to happen," I continued. "You are both going to remain in this house as guests, and guests only, until you have made arrangements to leave, which I suggest you begin making now. Cass, you were honest with me just now, which I appreciate, and so you have 30 days. Tyler, because you're my son and I love you, even in this particular moment, you have 60. These are not negotiable terms." "Mom," Tyler's voice cracked slightly on the word. "I'm not finished." I let the silence sit for a moment, the way a good surveyor lets the instrument settle before reading. "I also want you to understand what you actually said to me 3 weeks ago in this kitchen. You told me that physical property ownership was a social construct. You told me that self-determination was a universal right. You told me that decentralized governance was more legitimate than institutional authority." I looked at him. "Do you know what those arguments, applied consistently, actually mean?" He shook his head barely. "They mean that the person with the strongest claim to self-determination in this house is me. They mean that the institutional framework you were trying to dismantle, property law, residential rights, parental authority, was the framework that protects me from exactly what you were planning to do." I stood up. "You handed me the argument. You handed it to me at the dinner table while I served you lasagna. And then you were surprised when I used it?" I picked up my coffee cup and walked to the kitchen door. "The garden beds," I said, "still need winterizing. If either of you wants to earn coins for the propane tank, you'll need it before the temperature drops next week. I suggest you start this afternoon. I went to my study, closed the door, sat down at my desk, and let the shaking in my hands happen in private. It lasted about 45 seconds. Then it was done. The crown was on the desk. I put it on. I had one more call to make. Martha picked up on the second ring, same as always. "Eleanor," she said, "how's the kingdom?" "Expanding," I said. "Martha, I need to ask you about LLC structures and residential property transfers. Specifically, whether there are any early registration steps that can be taken to complicate an attempted property transfer by a third party." There was a pause. "Tell me everything," Martha said. I told her. She listened without interrupting, which was one of the things I'd always valued about Martha. She had the discipline to gather all the information before responding. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Okay," she said. "First, what they were describing would require your signature on multiple documents. They can't transfer the property without your active participation. So there's no immediate threat." "I know," I said, "but I'd like to be sure." "The most conservative move," she said, "would be to contact your estate attorney and have the property placed in your own single-member LLC or a revocable trust in your name before anyone else can make a competing proposal. It makes the ownership structure explicit and documented in a way that any subsequent proposal would have to directly contend with." "How quickly can that be done?" "Depending on your attorney, a week, maybe 2. Do you want me to give you a name? I know someone in Maplewood who's excellent." I wrote down the name. I called the attorney that afternoon. We had an appointment for Thursday. Meanwhile, something happened that I had not planned for, which is the nature of good operations. They acquire momentum you didn't anticipate. Priya had apparently told Dev about the cookout in detail, and Dev, who I now understood was something of an influencer within the tech community they all moved in, had posted about it on his social media. Not with my name, not with Tyler's, but with enough specificity that it was recognizable to anyone who knew them. He'd described it as the most elegant application of sovereign individual philosophy I've witnessed in practice, deployed by a retired federal cartographer in New Jersey against her son's decentralized governance pitch. He had included a photo of the Eleanoria flag. He had included, with what I felt was genuine aesthetic appreciation, a photo of the mama coins. By Wednesday morning, the post had been reshared several hundred times within Dev's network and had migrated outward from there. By Thursday, the day of my attorney appointment, it had been picked up by a technology newsletter that I had never heard of, but that apparently had 70,000 subscribers, under a headline I found deeply satisfying. "Retired Government Cartographer Out-Decentralizes Son's Decentralization Scheme." Cass showed me the article. He came to my study door with his laptop and knocked carefully, the way he'd been knocking since Tuesday morning. "You should probably see this," he said. I read it. It was accurate in its broad outlines, somewhat embellished in its details, and entirely supportive of my position. "There are comments," Cass said. "A lot of them." I scrolled down. There were comments. Many of them were from people in technology and blockchain communities who found the situation funny. Some were from people who found it philosophically interesting. Several were from women in their 50s and 60s who had used phrases like, "This is my new religion," and "queen behavior literally." One was from a professor of international law at NYU who noted with academic precision that while the Montevideo Convention could not technically apply to a residential backyard, the underlying argument about property rights as a form of sovereignty was not without merit. "Your mom coins are being discussed as an example of applied token economics," Cass said. I see that, I said. Someone wants to interview you for a podcast. I have an attorney's appointment in an hour, I said. I'll look at it when I get back. Tyler found out about the article the same way I did. Cass told him. He appeared at my study door 20 minutes later, and for the first time since this had all begun, he looked genuinely uncertain. Not defensive, not strategic, just uncertain. The way he'd looked at 7 years old when he'd done something and wasn't sure if I knew. Mom, he said. I have an appointment, I said. The article is accurate. People know. My friends know. Dev, I can't believe Dev posted. Tyler, I turned from my desk to look at him fully. Dev posted because what happened at the cookout was worth posting about. People responded because the situation is interesting. You spent months explaining to me that borders are obsolete and sovereignty belongs to the individual. And when I applied your argument to my own property, you were surprised. I stood up, gathered my coat and my bag. The interesting thing isn't that people are talking about it. The interesting thing is that they all immediately understood who was in the right. He stood aside to let me pass. At the bottom of the stairs, I paused. Tyler, I said, I'm going to my attorney's office to make sure this house is properly documented in my name in a way that leaves no ambiguity. When I get back, I'd like to have a real conversation. Not about philosophy, not about decentralization, about what you actually need and what you're actually planning and how we can talk about it honestly. I looked at him. Can we do that? He was quiet for a moment. Yeah, he said, we can do that. Good. I put on my hat. There are eggs in the fridge. Make yourself breakfast. The attorney's name was Patricia Okonkwo, and she was exactly as good as Martha had promised. She was in her 40s, precise and warm, with the kind of organized intelligence that I recognized from 31 years of working with competent professionals. I explained the situation, all of it, including the Kingdom Declaration, which I did not downplay, and watched her face move through several expressions before settling on something that was professionally neutral but had distinct notes of enjoyment at the edges. Your instincts are correct, she said. The most protective structure for your situation is a revocable living trust. It's clean, it's immediate, and it makes your ownership and control absolute and documented in a way that no competing proposal can reach without going through probate court. She set down her pen. Can I ask, the territorial declaration you filed with the municipality, the zone designation update? Yes. Does your son know you filed it? He knows about the declaration. He doesn't know about the filing, she looked at me. The filing makes the external boundary documentation real, not legally sovereign in international law terms, obviously, but as a registered land use designation. It creates a paper trail that establishes your active management of the property. She picked up her pen again. I like your methodology. I spent 31 years learning it, I said. The trust was drafted and ready for signature within 8 days. During those 8 days, the following things happened. The newsletter article was picked up by 2 larger publications, one of which actually called the house phone. I had not known anyone still called house phones. The journalist sounded briefly startled when I answered with, Kingdom of Elenoria, how may I direct your call? Before remembering that I was not, in fact, required to commit fully to the bit in every context. I declined the interview but noted the request. Cass completed his full 30-coin balance and was issued a month-long work visa, which he treated with what I can only describe as genuine respect, folding it carefully and storing it in his wallet. He also, over the course of those 8 days, winterized all 4 garden beds, bagged 12 cubic feet of leaves, and replaced a section of the back fence that had been loose since autumn. He was a remarkably good worker when he had a clear task and a visible incentive, which was, I thought, an interesting data point about the things Tyler had been saying about decentralized governance and earned value. Tyler and I had our conversation on a Thursday evening. We sat at the kitchen table with the leftover pasta and 2 glasses of wine, and he told me, for the first time since he'd come back in November, something that wasn't filtered through the framework of whatever ideology he'd been inhabiting. He told me about the layoffs at the San Francisco company, which had been more abrupt and more humiliating than he'd described. He told me about the freelance work, which was sporadic and anxious-making in a way that was new for him. He told me that he genuinely believed for a while that the LLC idea was good for both of us. And then, more quietly, that he understood now that he'd been thinking about it mostly in terms of what he needed and not enough about what I'd built. I listened. I did not make it easy by saying, "I know," or "It's fine." He needed to say it plainly, and he did. "The whole speech in the kitchen," he said eventually. "The systems are dead. Decentralization, all of it. I wasn't lying. I do believe those things. But I was also—" He stopped. "Using them to soften the ground," I said. "Yeah. I know." I refilled both glasses. "Tyler, you're not uniquely capable of that. Every negotiation I ever sat in involved someone using an ideological framework to justify a material interest. Usually, the frameworks were more elaborate than yours." I leaned back in my chair. "What I needed you to understand, what I still need you to understand, is that the argument works both ways. If sovereign individuals have rights to self-determination, then I'm a sovereign individual. If decentralized authority is more legitimate than institutional power, then my authority over this house is more legitimate than any authority you could derive from a shared LLC. You can't have the philosophy without the consequences." He nodded slowly. "Also," I said, "I need you to understand that I know things you don't know. Not because I'm older, or not only because I'm older, but because I have 31 years of specific professional expertise that you didn't account for when you decided to have that conversation with me." "The Montevideo Convention," he said, "among other things." A pause. "The LLC thing," he said, Is that why you're telling me to leave?" "That's part of it," I said honestly. "But it's not only that. Tyler, you came back here because you needed to regroup. That's legitimate. But you came back here and you reconfigured the household around your needs, your schedule, your guests, your workspace, your ideology, without really asking what I needed. And when I said, essentially, my house, my rules, you told me my rules were a relic of a dead system." I looked at him across the kitchen table. "That's not something you get to say to the person whose house you're living in for free." He was quiet for a long time. "Yeah," he said finally. "No, you're right. I know I am." "The crown," he said. "Were you wearing it this whole time because I wanted to make the point visibly and tangibly, yes. Because the thing you weren't taking seriously needed a physical form you couldn't ignore." He almost smiled. "The chalk line was accurate, by the way. I measured it with the app on my phone." "Of course it was accurate," I said. "I drew it." We talked for another hour, and when we were done, Tyler refilled the pasta bowls, and we ate in comfortable silence for a while, and then talked about other things. His sister in Portland, a trip he'd been thinking about, whether I was going to actually use the raised garden beds next spring or continue to talk about it. Normal things. The kind of conversation we used to have before he'd come home this time with his ideology and his plans and his friend in the North Face vest. It was almost midnight when he stood up to clear the plates. "Mom," he said at the sink, "I'm going to start looking for a place. Seriously. Not because you're kicking me out. I know you gave me 60 days. But because I think I need to." "I think so too," I said. "Can I—" He stopped, turned around. "Can I keep coming for dinner, like after I move out?" I looked at my son in my kitchen, his hands in the soapy water, asking permission to come to dinner in the house where he grew up. Tyler, I said, that's not a visa-eligible request. That's just being my son. He grinned. A real grin, the one I recognized from before all of this, the one he'd had at 9 and 12 and 18 and that had gotten buried somewhere under the hoodies and the podcasts and the decentralization. Okay, he said. You're always welcome to dinner, I said. You might still need to bring coins for the grill. He laughed. It sounded like relief. I went upstairs and sat at my dressing table for a while, looking in the mirror. The crown was on the table beside my perfume bottles. It caught the light and threw small prisms onto the wall. I had bought it as a prop, as a visual argument, as a deliberate and slightly absurd embodiment of a principle. I had not expected it to become something I thought of as mine. But then, that was the thing about lines. You draw them as tools, as instruments, as ways of making meaning legible, and then they become real. That was what Tyler had never quite understood, about borders, about authority, about the rules that organize a life. The line is the reality. The line holds because the person drawing it means it to hold. I had always meant mine to hold. I just hadn't needed to show him until now. The third act arrived with a journalist. Her name was Simone, and she wrote for a publication that covered technology culture and its collisions with the wider world, and she had gotten my number from a chain of contacts that originated, improbably, with the NYU professor who had commented on the newsletter article. She called on a Monday morning, and because I had spent 31 years dealing with press inquiries on territorial disputes and knew exactly how to handle them, I said I'd think about it and called Martha. Do the interview, Martha said immediately. I'm not sure I want the attention. Eleanor, you have a story that people in tech communities, legal communities, and what I can only describe as the general population of tired mothers are extremely invested in. Doing the interview on your terms, with control over what you say, is better than having the story told without you. She was, as usual, correct. I called Simone back. We met at my kitchen table on a Wednesday. She was in her 30s, sharp-eyed and tactful, with a recorder and a notebook and the professional attentiveness I associated with good researchers. She asked good questions. I gave careful answers. I explained the Montevideo Convention. I explained my professional background. I explained the currency system and the visa requirements and the zone designation filing and the timeline of events. I showed her the Eleanoria flag and the crown and the coin stack, now reduced to 11 since Tyler and Cass had spent most of their earnings on grill access and the propane tank situation had required significant diplomatic negotiation. She asked about Tyler. He's my son, I said. I'm not going to tell you he's a villain, because he's not. He made some decisions that weren't right, and I made sure he understood that. I folded my hands on the table. The thing I'd want people to understand is that I wasn't punishing him. I was teaching him, the same way I was taught, through consequences that matched the action. The mama coins, she said, with a smile she was trying to suppress. You'd call them a pedagogical tool? I'd call them economic incentive aligned with productive labor, I said, but pedagogical works too. She asked if she could photograph the backyard. I said yes. She took the photo from the back porch, and in the photograph that eventually ran with the article, you can see the chalk line still faint in the winter grass, the Eleanoria flag at its garden stake, the grill on the patio, and the crown sitting on the outdoor table where I'd left it that morning as if it lived there. Which, I suppose, it did. The article ran 3 weeks later, in early December, under the headline, "The Sovereign Backyard, How a Retired Cartographer Drew the Line on Her Son's Tech Bro Philosophy." It was, by any measure, very good. It was also accurate, which I appreciated more than I would have appreciated flattery. Tyler read it. He texted me after the crown photo is actually kind of great. I texted back, I know. Cass read it too. He sent me a longer message. Cass communicated better in writing than in person, I had discovered, which was interesting given that he'd spent most of our cohabitation in near silence. He said that the article had made him think about some things, and that he appreciated how I'd explained the coin system, and that he'd be moving out at the end of the month. He also said he'd winterized the last garden bed that afternoon and left the tools cleaned and hung properly in the shed. He'd left the remaining coins on the kitchen counter. I kept the coins. The real ending, the one that didn't make the article because it happened after Simone had filed her piece, was quieter than everything that had come before it. It was the first Sunday in December, a week after Cass had moved to a sublet in Brooklyn, and Tyler had put a deposit on a one-bedroom in Montclair, 14 minutes away. Tyler came for dinner. He brought a bottle of wine and a bag of groceries. He'd called ahead and asked what I needed. And he stood in my kitchen and made pasta from scratch while I sat at the table with a glass of wine, and we talked the way we used to talk when he was home from college, and the world was newer, and the distance between us was measured in miles rather than in ideology. After dinner, while he was washing the dishes, he said, without turning around, "I've been listening to different podcasts." "Oh?" I said. "Yeah. Someone recommended a series on the history of international law, the development of sovereignty concepts from Westphalia through the 20th century. A pause. "It's pretty interesting." "It is," I said. "You'd know a lot of it already." "Most of it," I said. "Some of it I was there for." He laughed. He dried the last dish and hung the towel on the rack and turned around. "Mom," he said, "I'm sorry for what I said in the kitchen back in November. About your rules being a relic and the system being dead." He met my eyes. I wasn't thinking about what I was actually saying to you, in your own house. I was just talking." "I know," I said. "And the LLC thing?" "Yes." "That was worse." "Yes," I agreed. He was quiet for a moment. "Is the kingdom—" He gestured toward the back window. "Are you going to keep it?" I considered this. Outside, the December backyard was dark and cold, the grass brown, the garden beds mulched and ready for spring. The chalk line was barely visible now, worn down by weeks of weather, but I knew exactly where it was. "The formal declaration," I said, "was always a teaching tool. It made a point." I paused. "But the principle stands. This is my house, Tyler, my territory, my rules." "Yeah," he said, "I know that now." "Do you?" "Yeah." He said it simply, without defense. "I really do." I stood up, took my glass to the counter. Outside, a neighbor's light came on across the back fence, casting a yellow rectangle on the dark grass. The old oak tree stood in its corner, bare and solid, roots deep in the ground that my chalk line had claimed, that my attorney's documents had confirmed, that 31 years of knowing exactly what sovereignty meant had always been defending. "Good," I said. "Then next time you want to use the grill, you don't need a visa. Just text me." He grinned, that grin again, clear and real and his. And I felt the thing in my chest that had been cold and precisely organized for 6 weeks shift slightly, like a compass finding north. "Deal," he said. I walked him to the door. He hugged me in the doorway, the brief, genuine hug of an adult child who has remembered something he'd briefly forgotten. And then he went down the porch steps to his car. I stood in the doorway for a moment after he drove away, feeling the cold December air on my face. Then I went inside, climbed the stairs, and put the crown on the shelf in my bedroom. Not away, just there where I could see it. It had done its work. It could rest now. Though I kept the coins. You never know when you'll need them. In February, the gardening supply catalog arrived, and I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and circled the tomato varieties I wanted to try in the new raised bed Tyler and Cass had built, though they had not known that was what they were building when they'd winterized the garden beds. I circled an heirloom called Mortgage Lifter, which I had grown once before and which had enormous, meaty fruits and an absurdly satisfying name. I circled a cherry tomato called Sun Gold, which I'd been meaning to try for years. And I circled a new variety I'd never heard of called Sovereignty, which the catalog described as reliable, productive, and difficult to knock over once established. I thought that sounded about right. I ordered all three. The article had run, the LLC plan had died quietly in the way that plans die when the person they target is paying attention, and my house was mine in the way it had always been mine, documented now in a trust with my name on it, just in case, but really just mine in the plain sense that I had bought it and paid for it and lived in it and knew every floorboard and window latch, and no amount of philosophical reframing was going to change the fact of that. Tyler called twice a week. He was applying for a position at a company that did something involving data infrastructure for municipal governments, which I thought had possibilities. Cass had started a new project, something involving earned value token systems in community organizations, which was, as far as I could tell, essentially the mama coin concept applied at scale. He'd sent me a message asking if he could cite it as a design precedent. I said yes and charged him 10 coins, theoretically, just to maintain the principle. By March, I had planted the first seedlings under grow lights in the kitchen. The tomatoes were coming, the garden beds were ready, the oak tree was budding, and every morning I made my coffee and stood at the kitchen window and looked at the backyard where the chalk line had been, invisible now, grown over by the first spring grass, and thought about lines and what they mean and why we draw them. Not to divide, not to exclude, to make the territory legible, to say, this is what is mine, this is what I've built, this is where my authority begins and where it holds. The crown was on the shelf upstairs. The coins were in a glass jar on the windowsill, catching the morning light. Tyler was coming for dinner on Sunday. He'd offered to bring the wine. Bring whatever you like, I'd said. Any requests? I thought about it. Something with a name that suits the occasion, I said. He'd shown up with a bottle of Bordeaux. On the label, in small print under the chateau name, was a French phrase I recognized from my years working European boundary disputes. It translated roughly as, "The land holds what the land holds." "Perfect," I said, and opened it. He looked at me across the kitchen, his coat half off, and said, "I know you don't need me to say this again, but for the record, Mom, you were right. About all of it." "I know," I said. "Wash your hands and set the table." He did. The wine was excellent. The tomatoes were 6 weeks from harvest, and the kingdom, though it had no further formal business to conduct, remained, in every way that mattered, exactly where I had drawn it.